Alright, so this video is going to talk to you about the prefatory materials for a formal analytical report. So we're going to start with some things that you want to keep in mind when you're writing your formal analytical report. Then we'll talk about the specific components that you need for your prefatory and supplemental materials, and these are all listed on the assignment sheet as well, so you can use that as a reference if you're one of my students. Then we'll look at a few sample formal analytical reports, and we'll talk through some of the things that those reports have done well, and maybe some of the pitfalls that they've encountered. So, some things to keep in mind. This is a formal report. In another video, I've talked about formal writing, so you should be seeing a link to that video. Keep in mind what exactly that means. I'm not going to go back over formal writing right now, but make sure that's a thing that you're remembering stylistically. Remember that you are writing to a specific person or group, small group like a committee or a board or something like that, which has the power to implement the solution that you're proposing or make the desired change. This is important for a couple of reasons. Remember, one of them is that you need to anticipate your audience's concerns, you need to anticipate their values, you need to anticipate the types of arguments that are going to be persuasive for them, and so on and so on. So, think about your audience. Think about what they believe, what they want, what they're going to be persuaded by, and so on and so on. And shape your rhetoric throughout this project around that set of needs, values, desires. Remember, this is persuasive, and so you're thinking about ethos, pathos, and logos. You're thinking about providing and interpreting evidence. You're thinking about appealing to your audience's values, and so on and so on. In particular, you need to decide on the best solution to the problem or the best way of capitalizing on the opportunity that you've identified. And you are making the argument for that one single solution. You're thinking about roughly 8 to 20 pages for the report, exclusive of prefatory and supplemental materials. I think this semester, actually, the guideline I've given is about 10 pages, but you're somewhere in that range. So, the prefatory materials themselves, you have 5 major components. You have a cover page. So the only thing that should appear on the cover page is the title of the report. The caveat to that is that this is a decorative page. And so if you have something like a decorative image, that's totally fine. But the only text that should generally appear is the title of the report itself. Your second page is going to be a title page. So on that, in the center of the page, you want 4 things. You want the title of the report, you want who it was prepared for, so that's the intended audience. You want who it was prepared by, so that would be you and or your group members. And then you want the date that it's being submitted. So that's the only 4 things that should be written on here. The third page is going to be a letter or memo of transmittal. So you can choose which of these you prefer to use, either memo format or business letter format. Make sure that this is formatted correctly, whichever approach that you choose to take. The way that you would want to decide, there's 2 sort of major criteria, I would say, for deciding whether you go with a memo or a letter. So a memo is generally going to be less formal. So if this is prepared internally, so if you are a member of the company that you're writing this report for, or if you were solicited to write this report or something like that, A memo would be the more appropriate version. The letter is going to be more formal, and so if this is unsolicited or if you're outside the company or something like this, the letter is going to be more appropriate. What exactly the letter or memo of transmittal does is somewhat open. Essentially, you are explaining the circumstances under which this report came to be written. So you may talk about the problem, you may talk about what you did to try and find a solution, you may talk about what your goals were, and you may sort of thank anyone whose assistance was beneficial in this process. So these are some of the kinds of things that you can do in a letter or memo of transmittal. The next page is going to be the table of contents, and this is a fairly straightforward one. You're going to list all of the sections with page numbers. And that's the page number on which they begin. So as you're listing your sections, you want to include both headings and subheadings for those listings, including things like appendices and the references. So the works cited or the bibliography, depending on whether you're using MLA or APA format. How you deal with illustrations, images, tables, charts, graphs, etc., etc. Sometimes people will incorporate them into the table of contents, although that's not the normal way of doing it. And the problem with that is it can make the table of contents much more confusing. So a more standard way of doing things, sometimes people just leave it out altogether and don't have a specific listing for illustrations and so on. But the other thing that you can do that people often do is incorporate a separate table of illustrations. So that's really useful because it can point readers directly to where they can find visual information. So graphs, charts, tables, important images, etc., etc. That's a really useful thing to incorporate. And then the fifth and final piece of your prefatory material is going to be the executive summary. So this is a one-page overview of the argument that you're making in the formal analytical report. It should present all of the information in condensed form in one page from the formal analytical report in the order that it's presented in the report itself. So if you've used the direct approach in the formal analytical report, use the direct approach for the executive summary. If you've used the indirect approach for the report, use the indirect approach for the executive summary. The executive summary will give away the entire argument, so I don't have a good answer on how that works with the indirect approach. But the idea behind the executive summary is that a busy reader should be able to read this and get the main points of the entire argument without having to read the whole report. So these are your 5 major things that you need to include, and we'll take a look at some samples in just a minute so you'll get a better sense of what these things can look like. The other thing that you need to incorporate in addition to the body of the report itself is some supplementary elements. There are 2 that you need to incorporate. So one is a set of references or a bibliography. So a works cited page or a bibliography, a references page, whatever it is. You can use MLA, APA, Chicago-style citations, or any other type of recognized citation format, but you want to make sure that these are correct, that your formatting is correct, and that all of the research that you've done is properly cited. The other thing that you need to include is an appendix. So any sort of supplemental materials, things that are too long, things that are not crucial to the body of the report itself, should be presented in appendix or appendices, depending on how many of them that you have. And typically appendixes are given letters. So Appendix A, Appendix B, Appendix C, etc., etc. So some of the things that people tend to include, if you did a survey or surveys, you may include lists of survey questions. We don't need these for the report itself, but they may be useful additional information. If you have large data sets beyond what you actually needed for the project itself, for the argument itself, you can include that. Transcripts of interviews, additional images, infographics, charts, tables, graphs, whatever it is, those can all be presented in appendices. The other thing that you have as an option is you can write up an index. I have written indexes before for articles, and they're a decent amount of work and not necessarily that much payoff for fairly short documents. So I would probably recommend steering away from it, but for a longer report, like say a 50, 75, 100 page report, an index is going to be really useful for readers because it's going to let them find specific key concepts. So basically what an index is a list of major terms or major references, major ideas with the page numbers on which they appear. So you can go to the index and let's say you're looking for a specific term. You can use that index to find every page where that term appears, and so you can then sort of only look through the sections that are going to be relevant. But again, they're a good amount of work. You don't need to do it for this project, so I would suggest probably sticking with just a references list and the appendix. So let's take a look at some sample formal analytical reports. Alright, so we're going to take a look at these 3 sample formal analytical reports. We're going to take a look at their prefatory materials so you can get a sense of the kinds of things that tend to work and maybe a couple of things to avoid. So in terms of title pages, generally these 3 are pretty good. So we've got here the title of this report, Updating the Ramada's Database Management System, and we've got a good decorative image here of a Ramada. We do have this bit here at the bottom, powered by Oracle Hospitality, that goes with the decorative image. Because it's text-based, it may or may not be the best thing to have included. You probably could have cut that off the image and we'd still be fine. But we've got the main thing that we need on the cover page, which is the title. We've actually got a similar issue here where the logo that we have up at the top has text in it, in this case Penn State Alternative Brakes, but we've got sort of multiple titles here. We got Penn State Alternative Brakes, which marks a subtitle, the best vacation club out there, and then we've also got a second subtitle, a thorough review and recommendations for current club marketing and branding for Penn State Alternative Brakes. So we've got some perhaps over titling here, and we do have an image that has text, which is not necessarily fantastic, but we once again have a decorative, stylized cover page that's very effective and is going to get readers' attention. The same thing here with this third one. We have the title, capped accessibility at Beaver Stadium. So we have the title, we have a decorative format, we have a decorative image. So this is the only one of the three that doesn't, I mean, it's got Penn State here, but that, because as we'll see through this report, this is actually part of their header, which is not necessarily fantastic because it does end up taking up a lot of space on the page. But because this is part of the header, we can probably ignore that as additional text. Following that, title pages. We've got, again, the title of the report, who it was prepared for, so who's the intended audience, who it was prepared by, and for privacy reasons I've blacked out their names, and then the date that this was written, or the date that this was prepared. The same thing here, title up at the top, prepared for, prepared by, and the date. So these are the four things that you want on your title page. Title, prepared for, prepared by, and this one actually is missing the date, so that is a potential problem with this first of these samples, but it's not necessarily a major problem. So you would want somewhere in this bottom portion to have the actual date listed, but other than that, it's okay. So after that, you want a memo or a letter of transmittal. Ideally, you would want to, from, date, and subject to be caps locked, but within the memo of transmittal itself, there's an explanation of what the report does, why this author chose to write it, and then some information about what the report itself is actually going to talk about, etc., etc. So that's the kind of thing that you want with the letter or memo of transmittal. This one isn't labeled letter or, in this case, memo of transmittal, so you would want memo or memo of transmittal somewhere there. But again, set up memo format, and it takes us through the same kind of information, an explanation of what exactly the report is doing. And one thing that this author has done that's really useful is they've presented contact information at the bottom, and so if the reader wants more information or they have specific questions, they can contact either by phone or by email this author. And we get the same thing here, the memo set up in memo format. Again, ideally that should be caps locked, but that's a minor issue. And an explanation of what this report is doing and why. Then we move on to the table of contents. Tables of contents, there's a lot of different ways you can set these up, but some of the basic things you're going to always see: section title, so in this case executive summary, introduction, accessibility at Beaver Stadium, etc., etc., and then the page number. So this is the page number on which that section begins. So one thing these authors have done is they've put Roman numerals and then letters for subsections. So that's a really useful way of seeing the relationship between sections. We can follow the progress of sections through that. This author hasn't done that, but what this author has done is, sorry, my cat's using the litter box, so you can hear him scraping in the litter over there. But what this author has done is bolded section headings, so executive summary, introduction, problem, a closer look, and then listed subsections in just regular text. So PSAB needs to grow in participants and focus on branding efforts. More trips equal more participants needed, etc., etc. And then again, we've got the page numbers on which these things occur. And with this author, one of the things, so again, we don't have a numbered table of contents, which is actually pretty standard, if I'm honest. But one of the things this author has done that's really useful is put these connecting lines, or these lines of dots between the name of the section and the page number. And what that does visually is makes it much easier for readers to follow along. Whereas if we look at this one, say you wanted to find Penn State versus other schools, you have to sort of trace your way along there without any guiding lines, and you have to figure out, all right, that's on page 9. But you could sort of, I'm not 100% sure, it's somewhere in there. Whereas when we look at something like this with the guiding lines, that tells you exactly which page a particular item is on. The other thing to note with the tables of contents, and this is more of a section headings thing, but it's something that's important, there are different degrees of detail. So introduction, why upgrade, solution, conclusion. These are what are called descriptive section headings. They describe what a section does without telling us anything about it in particular. And we have the same thing really over here. Penn State versus other schools, the solution, the challenge. So we know broadly what these sections are going to be about without knowing the arguments this author or these authors are making. Whereas if we look to this second sample, we have much more detail. So the subsection headings here, especially in this first section under the problem and the section under the fix, these are much more detailed. So PSAB needs to grow in participants and focus on branding efforts. More trips equal more participants needed. Rebranding will help the club. Diversity and outreach efforts will be most effective in getting new members. These are what are called informative section headings. So they tell us about the argument that section is actually going to be making, which is really, really useful because then we as readers can decide whether or not we actually want to read that section or we want to just accept that section's conclusion. So if I read the section heading, or subheading in this case, diversity and outreach efforts will be most effective in getting new members, I can say, all right, I accept that. I'm going to skim or even skip this section because I'm a busy reader and I don't want to devote that much time to this. So I do recommend trying to use informative section headings wherever possible because they're going to tell your reader more information about the content of that section, which is going to help your readers understand what's going on. And then lastly, the executive summary. So again, this is going to be a one-page description of the overall argument that your formal analytical report is making. You're going to follow the same order. So in principle, I should be able to look back to the table of contents and say, okay, this is what the order of this argument looks like it's going to be. And then I should be able to follow that through the executive summary. This sample formal analytical report also has a list of illustrations with images and tables, which is another useful thing you can do with table of contents. The executive summary here, and also with our third sample that we're going to look at, has some section breaks. So section breaks are pretty much always a useful tool within extended pieces of writing, and even within something like the executive summary, which is covering a lot of content in a very short space. So what these authors have done that's really useful is they've given us section headings that tell us a lot about what the following paragraph is actually going to cover. Whereas in this one, we've actually got the opposite of what we've got with the table of contents, where we have some very basic section headings, the problem, the solution. But again, these describe what we actually get, the information that we actually get in that particular section of the executive summary.